And we're live on YouTube. Sorry for the wait, folks. Zoom crazy credentials and host um, uh, capabilities had to move around a bit, but appreciate everybody being patient. And appreciate everybody jumping on to another Open RFC call. These are the deep dive conversations that we're having that alternate with the more general purpose Open RFC calls that we're running here at NPM. These are supposed to be opportunities, or discussion here is supposed to be an opportunity to go further into conversations about our RFCs or issues or ideas, topics that we want to get a little bit more feedback from the community on, and hopefully move initiatives forward. There is a meeting notes, a HackMD doc that if you can, feel free to add yourselves to as attendees. I'll be doing my best to take notes as I believe Claudia, our resident note taker, can't make it today. So I'll do my best to try to take notes as we go along the agenda, which was posted in the issue in the npm/RFCs repo. So if you're ever looking for the upcoming agenda for the next RFC meeting, we try to post it about a week ahead of time, doing best to try to give folks lots of notice about what we'll be talking about and what's on the agenda. As usual, these conversations and any discussion in issue threads or on our repos is covered by a code of conduct. So just be mindful to, raise your hand when you can, be courteous and kind to other folks when they're talking. As well, again, just the desired outcomes of these meetings is hopefully to move discussions forward and to have another touch point with the community around certain subjects here. That's why we call these the deep dives. Today, specifically, we're going to be talking about dependency resolutions and hopefully bubbling up some use cases in that area. But before we jump into that, does anybody have any announcements that they wanted to bring up? Anything going on in the community we should be aware of or promote? If not, we'll dive in. So we want to scope the conversation today around dependency resolutions, or around, this can go in a couple different ways, as we've had topics brought up around either supporting yarn style resolutions or including discussions around also what to do now that we're planning on installing peer deps by default. Internally, we've had some discussions about this. Isaac, Roy, myself, even just before this call, we're talking a bit about some of the scenarios that the community is finding itself in, and how we can address these things going forward. So Isaac, I might give you the floor to further sort of go into detail about what we're looking for from folks today, and maybe less solutioning, but more bubbling up the scenarios and use cases folks are finding themselves in today.
Yeah, so basically, yarn style resolutions are kind of it's a feature that can be used in a lot of different ways. And my concern with it is it's essentially one of these like infinite API exposure surface type of features. The other thing is kind of more qualitative, or comes down to kind of like what is the theory of what a package manager should do. I think a package manager should manage your packages for you. And so if we find ourselves in cases where we're like, oh, well, the way you fix this is you figure out what dependency you want to resolve to and write it down. That feels to me like a little bit of an inappropriate abdication of NPM's responsibilities, since it should be able to determine what the case is and then do the right thing. So before, I'm not opposed to apart from kind of those caveats, I'm not opposed to the feature if we establish that it is the best the best way to resolve or solve certain kinds of problems. But before we do, just start digging into into saying, well, we're going to, implement yarn resolutions in npm. I wanted to take this deep dive to go through some of the use cases that people are currently using it for, and hopefully, just really understand exactly what are the categories of things that that people are doing with resolutions today. And for each one of those, then we can, either on this call or later, when we do have a sort of a full understanding of what someone is trying to do and what the situation is, see if there is a better way that we can address it. So npm install just works, or if some other feature is the best way to address it. So maybe an easier, sort of less foot gunny type of dependency resolution, explicit dependency resolution, or just say, yeah, this is actually a good use case for doing resolutions. This makes it worthwhile. Let's go ahead and implement it. So, yeah. Wes, you had said that you had some situations to share or talk about. Do you want to dive into any of that?
Yeah, sure. So I was unable to do a full write-up. Sorry, time constraint. But I can go through what is effectively, so there's the most popular case that I found in our usage at Netflix, and then there is the most complicated case, and I'll lay out both of those. So the most popular case is just a really, really simple, there is a bug that is yet to be fixed in a transitive. We would like to force resolve to a known fixed version. So the transitive, so the problem here is that the intermediary libraries have not yet updated, but the app owner knows for a fact that there is a good version that works in their app, and they want to just force the entire tree to use it. So this, and I say bug, and I should have maybe been a little bit more vague on that. There are reasons. So the most common is a bug, but another common one is that I found is React. So React needs one copy through the entire tree. Different component libraries can sometimes define things incorrectly in their package dependency list, which results in React being in there multiple times. So that is the other, it's the simple case, it's the same use case as far as how you define the resolution, but a different reason for that use case. So basically there that people are just saying, I want React 16 dot, let me find one that's an exact example here, 16.9.11. And that means that no matter what, all of their dependencies in the tree, transitive component, things, they're going to get React 16.9.11, and they know for a fact that that works. It looks like we also have that for the types packages. So for TypeScript as well, that's another common use case where it's, again, just a very simple, for anywhere in my tree, I want this package to be at this version. Similar to that is the transitive one, where it's, again, it's just, I want all to be at this version, but it's not a direct dependency. It's just, there's a transitive somewhere in there that might be included multiple times, where we just map one package to one version. Okay, so that's the simple case. The more complicated case is,
so wait, before you move on to that, in these cases where we have this transitive dependency and there are reasons why we want to lock it into one specific resolution, is that a resolution that is not, that doesn't satisfy the stated dependency in these things that I depend on?
Yes, always. Okay. Well, okay, I say always. Everyone that I have seen, it is possible that there are some of these are kind of hard to dig into, because you have to install a whole tree and really go, deep into the dependency graph to figure out what specifically they're trying to avoid. But in every case that I have found, it is, it does not satisfy the explicitly stated dependencies.
I guess if it did, it would deduplicate up the tree anyway.
I think it depends on the case, but yeah, in most cases, I think it would. I mean, I think if it's, we would have to make some test cases to know for sure if that is always true.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are some cases where you could trick it into not deduplicating, even though it satisfies the semver range.
Oh, actually, yeah. So if this is the preferred dedupe flag that we're adding in 07 in npm 7 that Arborist does today, where there is a case where, let's say, I depend on A at, 1.2.3, and I install something that depends on A at 1.x. If there's a newer 1.x than 1.2.3, it will install the latest and greatest on the assumption that that's better, right? That it's like better to have the newest version that you can support. With the preferred dedupe flag, it will always prefer to take whatever's already in the tree if that's satisfactory.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
some of those
definitely a use case here.
Some of those cases may, and we've actually had some conversations where it might make sense to just have preferred dedupe be the default, right? And say, prefer newest is the flag that you opt into. I only didn't make it the default because it's not the default behavior in npm 6, but like there's no conceptual reason why that's necessarily better. Anyway, go on. So you got more to say on the simple version, or
No. I think that wraps that up. I think that's the most well-known use case too. I don't know if anybody has anything to add on utilizing that use case today. No. Okay. So the more complicated use case, and I don't have an example in front of me, so I'm trying to do this from memory. So we had a case where in a specific version of Node, there was an error in a transitive. So this was, I think, a gRPC thing. So the transitive, which was 3 layers deep, needed to be updated, and only that one needed to be updated. The dependency existed in the tree higher up in some apps, and they wanted to ensure that only the specific version in this transitive was updated to a known good version and leave the rest alone in the tree. So this required the deep matching, which was like, look specifically in this tree path and only if it is this particular version. And the key there was that it also needed to override the package lock, because the package lock was conflicting with the resolution. And I think in this case it was yarn, so it was a yarn lock thing, but the lock was conflicting. And so they added a resolution, but they were still seeing the error. And the resolution was a fairly complicated one. It like reached deeply into the tree. But when they applied these resolutions, the package lock was still overriding the resolution, which meant that the error was not going away and it was mysterious, and folks had a lot of trouble debugging that.
Yeah, it seems like the takeaway there should be that we basically trust the go based on the resolution rather than the package lock, if one exists.
Yeah, but the point there was it wasn't just a top level path, which is the more simple use case. It was a deep path, and it needed the ability to filter out ones further up in the tree, right? So even if the rule looked like star gRPC blah blah blah, some internal package, star, and then I think it was gRPC client. Right. So it wasn't just a matter of like take all versions of gRPC client. It was only when they were under this other path.
Right. And that's the logical path on the tree or the physical path?
I do not know how yarn resolutions work on that case. I'm guessing it's the logical, because it wouldn't make any sense if it was the physical, because that could change as you start deduping, right?
Right. So essentially what we need to say is, we need a way, if we wanted to address that use case, we would need a way to say, if you have a version matching, X at Y, and it is being loaded as a dependency of a version matching A at B, et cetera, multiple levels deep, then the resolution should be this particular version.
Yep.
Okay.
So those are the two use cases I was able to identify in our usage of yarn resolutions.
Right. I'd want to know, or it might be useful to know, like, what you said that there's a bug in a transitive depth, and then you kind of amended that to say bug is, there are reasons. I'm kind of curious what some of those other reasons are. If you can share.
I don't have any concrete metrics on that. Does it matter?
It might. So the reason why I ask is, let's say the reason is something that we could programmatically determine and address, right? We can then save you the trouble of then that's actually not a thing that is that should require human interaction. That's a thing where we should just update our tree building logic to make that not a problem.
So I have an example that's not just bugs, if that would help.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to.
So like in the case of React, for example, there are, but this is actually true for anything. Like there are dependency ranges or peer dependency ranges that correctly tie them, like couple themselves to majors, as opposed to using like greater than or equals, right? And sometimes the upgrading, or like, so they'll use a caret, right? Or they'll use a tilde even and peg themselves to a minor. And maybe I want to use a newer minor of React, or maybe I want to use React 17. And even though all of those packages haven't explicitly declared a compatibility, a peer dependency that allows React 17, maybe I've tested it and it works, but I don't want my graph to be invalid. I don't want to like have to do a bunch of crazy things to make sure that there's one copy of React in the entire tree, and that's React 17. So some sort of resolution feature could allow me to knowingly use something that is allegedly invalid, but works. Right, sort of like how the engines field, like there's a lot of things that say, oh, we require node 10, but maybe it works fine on node 8. Like, and it's easy for me to knowingly opt out of that warning essentially and say, yeah, it works, I'm fine with that. Similarly, like the contract is important, but being able to knowingly extend it, I think is useful for new features even alone. Like when React 16.9 came out with hooks, like maybe I had something that says, oh, I only work with React up to 16.8 because I haven't been tested with anything else yet. But I can just, I want to upgrade to React 16.9 and 16.9 and know that there's like, and I know that it works. And so I want to like trick that library basically into being compatible with 16.9. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. Like testing out with a new version of a framework.
Well, yeah, like testing it out, certainly, but I can ignore npm ls warnings for that, or I can like manually muck with my node modules. It's more like I want to move forward with that new version of a framework, even though all of my dependencies haven't caught up to it yet. This happens a lot with ESLint. So the Airbnb style guide, for example, when a new major of ESLint comes out, it has like 4 peer dependencies, and each of those has to upgrade to allow the new version of ESLint. ESLint 7 is about to come out, so I'm going to have to deal with this yet again. And the people, anybody who wants to use ESLint 7 has to wait for all of those peer dependencies to explicitly support it, even if it already happens to work for all the rules they happen to enable. And there's no clean way for them to just say, no, just use ESLint 7, like be quiet, I know it's gonna work. And like, instead they have to go harass me on a GitHub issue. Whereas if I could tell them, like, with caveats, do this resolution, and it'll work for now while we upgrade the ecosystem, then like everyone else is unblocked, no one has to bother me about it. And, you know, as the maintainer of like 3 of those 4 peer dependencies, I also have a little more leisure time to push those updates out.
Right. So one of my concerns then is like, or one of the things that was brought up in previous conversations about this, should resolutions be something that is ever relevant below the root level project? I'm tempted to say no.
Not in my opinion.
Like, yeah. I'm tempted to agree with you because
I think like I think there's a lot of NPM features that need a distinct division between packages and apps, and this is absolutely an app feature and should not be a package feature.
Should not be a package feature in that it goes publishing with the package. I think there are times where, so there are definitely times where for testing, you might want to temporarily define a resolution in libraries, but it would not get published along with, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but in that case, the library, like when you're developing the library is the app.
Okay, sure. You're
So
running.
what I mean is like whether it's published. Yeah, so whether it's like package lock where it's not published, or whether it's like yarn lock where it ignores it when it's in known modules, the effect is the same, that it's for apps and not libraries. But you can use it within, for local testing within a library.
Yeah, the way I would approach that is that resolutions actually live in package JSON. They go ahead and get published, but we just only care about it at the root level.
Yeah, that's totally fine to me. I mean, you could even make sure it doesn't go into the pacument, but that might be the default.
Yeah, I mean, it would be in the full pacument, but not the corgi duck. So, yeah, this other thing that's a little bit interesting to me, I'd like to dig into a little bit, is an issue that we've seen in the past a few times. We've had some conversations around like a prefer singleton type of mode for some of these packages. And in particular with React, I mean, the challenge with React and saying, well, React should always only be a singleton is the like the inc use case, right? So you might have, and this is actually, I think, Wes, I think you were the one who talked about this being the case in even some web apps, where there is actually a use case to having multiple Reacts in your tree. Even though it might not be good to have multiple Reacts in any given process or any given web page, a single project with a node modules folder might be multiple different processes or multiple different web pages or websites that all use kind of a shared node modules folder. So the inc use case is I'm using inc to design my CLI app stuff. Inc has a peer dependency on React 16, but I can use inc on the CLI with React 16 and use React 15 in my actual website, and everything is fine, right? They're completely separate environments, but they might both be pulling out of the same node modules folder because I have, my test tooling and everything, and my linter and all my other sort of CLI tooling in that same node modules folder. And I'm not actually loading.
That kind of sounds like Reynos's bin dependencies RFC. Like
yeah,
that would be addressed by it a bit.
That RFC is way too big.
Sure, but I meant like if your CLI when used by a consumer was stored separately, then like I feel like that problem would go away, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, but then we get into like, well, but I should break. I don't want to.
I know that's a deeper subject. Sorry.
For the trees, I mean it's way too convoluted. But the
this is my worry though, is that we start going into these cases and we end up going the route that Yarn v2 took, right? Like, I don't think we need to solve for all use cases to make this feature valid to ship and highly usable by the end user, right? So like if a user has a use case where they need 2 Reacts in a tree, like there's nothing stopping them from getting that today without resolutions. Maybe they need to, you know, define their resolution. If they were to add a resolution on top of that and needed to exclude something, like supporting that seems fairly straightforward just by having it be the top level, like not defining a deep, you know, star glob pattern for this. And then we get the basic feature without having to worry about that very niche use case, right?
Well,
yeah,
I mean,
so
but resolutions also don't have to be flat, right? Like just like import maps in the browser, you could be able to say, for the scope of this package, I want to have a resolution apply, but only for that package's subgraph.
we could also say that any React 16.x should resolve to 16.10.2. And so if your package, and then the way that I would check that is to say, okay, if my dependency is on 16.9.1, right? Let's say I've pinned my pure dependency because I am an extremely persnickety person who cares only about my own convenience. So I've pinned my pure dependency to 16.9.1, and you're using my module and you want to use 16.10.2. Well, my thing resolved to a version that's within the 16.x range, and therefore it's going to instead be pinned to 16.10.2. That could actually be a lot simpler. So we could have resolutions. You know, I'm getting into solutioning a little bit here, but I think that we could get very close to like ensuring that at least within the scope of React 16, it is a singleton within my tree. And if there's a React 15, then that might be a different singleton or a different resolution with a different scope. We could also limit it based on, other conditions. And I don't want to go, I don't want to implement a Prolog style resolution like domain specific language. I think it is something that we should be able to, we should limit the power to like what can be done declaratively in a package JSON with like a reasonably small number of lines, right? The other thing that's a little bit dicey or I think just kind of confusing, and I've seen some people get wrong, is using glob patterns in a dependency graph type of path. So because the dependency graph is a graph and not a tree, there are cycles, there are, things are not laid out on disk the same way that they appear, that they sort of would be in the graph, because that would be impossible, and so on. So using glob patterns feels like a little bit of like an impedance mismatch. And that's another thing that I think is kind of a big caveat to the to Yarn resolutions, Yarn selective version resolutions. And one thing that I would say is a blocker against actually just implementing it the same way that Yarn does. What I'd want to do is say, if you have a package that resolves within this name and range, and potentially a couple of other conditions, then this is the version you should resolve to.
And those conditions are something to do with where it resides in the graph, right? I mean, that's the only other condition that I can think of.
Yeah, so those conditions would be some way of expressing like that it's a dependency of X or Y or Z. You get very quickly into needing a domain specific language though. So, and I'm trying really hard to avoid that. So it does get a little hairy. Like I can see why Yarn v2 went the way that they did. I don't like it.
So I understand that we might not be able to represent all of these cases perfectly. But I think that's actually letting perfection get in the way of the good, or whatever the saying is, right? Because again, if you look at what we have a lot of people using resolutions, and even the most complicated case is still representable by a very basic glob pattern on the logical position of the package in the, and I say tree loosely, I guess I should say graph, right? So if you look at a real world use case, if that is the most complicated one that we can find, and I think we should farm for, you know, people to come with their most complicated real world use cases here, then why do we care about the perfect ability to represent every case, right? That's where Yarn went wrong. And I think if we just say like, yeah, we recognize that glob patterns don't make perfect sense, but they're actually the most ergonomic solution to this problem. And I think that's a reasonable end state.
Right. So I mean, so I'm a little bit concerned about the, you know, kind of the limitations and caveats that nested packages may not work properly. Although I guess that's just saying that, like, you know, you might stick a version of something in somewhere that doesn't actually meet whatever dependency was required. The thing that it's not a maximally ergonomic solution to is the case where I want to limit all of my React 16.x to 16.10.2, but I don't want to affect React 15. In that case, I have to basically, I would have to have a React resolution at the top level, and then another one that overrides it for, you know, within ink. And taking that into account when building the ideal tree can be pretty hairy, right? I have to basically hold on to like which resolution is sort of active given the path that I'm traversing.
But if we think about the user experience on that, that's like super straightforward, right? Like if I'm a end user there and I see in a package JSON React, you know, and then a version, and then a subpath with React and a version, like super legible. I, as an end user, I think would be very easy. For me, it'd be very easy to reason about what that does. Maybe we have to jump through hoops on the implementation side, but to me, that's a very acceptable thing to do. I mean, I know you're the one who's got to think about how to actually implement it, but still, like,
as the person jumping through these hoops. Yeah, so I mean, the downside, the user facing, the kind of user impacting downside of adding more complexity there is potentially introducing bugs when we're doing other things with this package tree, right? So those hoops have to be jumped through every single time, and I could see it being a little bit hairier in some cases. I'm not sure it's significantly worse to say, well, React 16.x should resolve to 16.1.2, right, or 16.10.2. Because essentially what we're saying is anything that would resolve within version X will be resolving to version Y. You know, it's one line instead of two, I guess, in the ink case. And it allows you to say, it basically allows you to do this without having to know about ink, right? So tap, if you do it wrong, if you just say, I want React to pin to version 16.10.2, right? Because I've got 3 deps I'm using and they're squabbling with each other and they're pulling in different versions. Or you know, I want React to resolve to 15 dot whatever. And so I say React resolve to 15 blah blah blah. The error I get is not like, hey, you know, your resolution is bad. The error I get is ink just blows up entirely with some like error about a global variable not being an object. Right. So Wes, yeah, what you basically said in chat here in Zoom, I don't know if that's going to be tracked in the notes or anywhere else, but the resolutions would be on the key would be a package at some version range, and then the value would be package at some specific version.
Well, or even a range again.
Or even another range, yeah.
Yeah.
Presumably you would want it to be more narrow. But
yeah, well, it could just be that a point version that was being pulled in is not good. And again, this is where the lock comes in, right? Like the case here would be, I want to apply a resolution, and then the next time the tree is resolved, that resolution would override and update the lock, right? And that's why you might not necessarily even go more specific. You might just say slightly newer point range on that.
Yeah, I mean, updating the lock is actually easy, because whenever we do a build ideal tree, like NPM 7 is a little bit less locked by the lock, right? So when we do a build ideal tree, we read in the lock file and we treat that as the starting point for what we want the ideal tree to be. And then from there, so if you're doing update all, we just throw the lock file away and rebuild it, because you're updating the whole tree, right? This is like the rimwrap and reinstall use case. So you can just type npm update to do that. If you're doing an audit fix, it fixes those dependencies all the way through the lock. If you're updating a particular version, we go through the entire, every instance of that lock file. And essentially in the build ideal tree process, we make certain changes to the tree. And all of those changes automatically get updated in the lock that we save back. So if we said, well, when you do build ideal tree, we load what's in the lock file, and then we apply these, custom resolutions to them. What I would do, the way I would approach that is to say, like, load the virtual tree from the lock file. If the virtual tree already says that it has these resolutions that have been applied to it, right, I can save those back into the lock file. If they haven't been applied, then just find all the instances of React and any of them that match version 16. I want to, say, oh, this is actually invalid, and I have to update it because it's not the correct version.
I actually don't think you can just use the lock saying it applied the resolution at a point in time does not mean that it is still valid, right? So if you have a resolution, I think it needs to re-resolve every time, irregardless of the state, right? Because what if a new version has been published in the range that the resolution is telling you, right?
So
like this.
If a new version has been published in the range that in the result range, right? Like let's say I have this jerky dependency that some inconsiderate person pinned their peer dependency to React 16 1.2. And so in order to get around this situation, I create a resolution that says React at 16.1.2 should instead resolve to React at 16.x. In that case, what's in the lock file, the only time when what's in the lock file is still a point in time of all of those resolutions, right? So I might, if I'm updating React and I would be resolving it to 16.1.2, okay, then I need to do that. But if the resolutions in package.json don't match the resolutions in package lock.json, then what that means is those resolutions were not applied when that ideal tree was created, and I have to go through and reapply them. But if I'm just loading the ideal tree and I'm not going to update React because what I'm doing is I'm just installing what's in the lock file, then I don't have to reapply those resolutions because I know that they were applied last time this tree was generated. Again,
that makes more sense to me now that you explained it out like that. And I think that what I was thinking actually, because the idea would be you've applied the resolutions that should get your app working. Even if there's a newer version, you don't really care. It's just like you used a lock before. It's just that it's got the resolution applied, which shouldn't break, which should keep the build time guarantee without putting you back into a broken state, I guess is what I was trying to get at. So that makes sense.
Right. So then the trick there is if the root node has some resolutions, then when I'm basically calculating whether or not a dep is valid, I should look to those resolutions and say, this gets tricky. So then the other problem is, like, let's say my resolution says React at 16 should be React at 16.1.2. And I have a pinned dependency on React at 15 or 16. It's not clear that it will resolve to something within the range. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not easily determinable whether or not the resolution should apply when calculating whether or not a dep is valid, because my dependency is still going to say some other version of React, which might not be satisfied by 16.1.2. Like, if my version was React at caret 16.9, you know, without really getting into some complexity of, like, calculating if ranges are subsets of one another, which is notoriously hard to do in a comprehensive way. So calculating dep validity would be a little bit tricky unless we stash that information somewhere, you know, either in the lock file metadata or something, to say you wanted this version, but you got that one because of a resolution. I guess that's the easy solution. We just always slap more metadata into the lock file. It's also,
which is also helpful to the humans. So I actually like that approach, right? Because then the human can go and see, because that's one thing that we have so one of the things I did during this week was chat with some of my Java teammates, and they have a fairly comprehensive, set of features in Gradle around this. And that's definitely one of the things that is common when folks use that is why. Like, they have this, they have a thing, a resolution rule, but in the end, the end user doesn't really know why they got the version they got. So being able to answer those questions in a really easy way would be very helpful for, for the end user. And if it was just something that was stored in the lock file that gave, like, a fairly straightforward description of, like you said, this is what you asked for, this is what you got because of this resolution rule, that'd also be very helpful.
You could imagine a really useful, like, npm y or npm explain command that took a package name and answered that question. And so even if we don't have that ability, it seems useful to think about the metadata in terms of, can it answer that question in the future?
Right.
Awesome. I appreciate anybody that's adding to these notes. Just be mindful of time. We got about 8 minutes left here. I know we started a bit late, but want to make sure that we are tracking all these use cases and that the notes are accurate as well. Feel free to update them even post this call. You did note, Wes, quickly, also it might be good to try to poke the community for use cases beyond sort of the scope of what you've seen in your org or in the wild. Do you have any suggestions on how best to do that?
I mean, I guess we could reach out to Mail, right, and talk about Yarn there.
For sure. Although you also, just to backtrack on some of the other notes, you also were advising us maybe we don't want to walk down the same road.
Yeah, totally. But I think we can chat with him without going down the same road, right?
Sure.
I think that hearing from them on the path that led to the solution that is in Yarn 2 would be incredibly valuable, even if the intent is to not go the same direction, right?
Right. When was the last time Mile or anybody from, let's say, Yarn or PMPM joined the package maintenance working group calls? Do you happen to know?
Never.
Okay.
I think, as far as I know, never. We reached out and invited at one point, but I don't think we ever got any. We can try again. I think if there was a topic that was had a good enough draw there, that might, incentivize more engagement than we
Sure, I'm
got.
just wondering if there's like neutral ground in case they are don't feel like joining these calls specifically,
Yeah, totally.
as it is very NPM focused, but having discussion maybe also kicked back up upstream might help get their involvement or be able to ask those questions. Also,
Yeah,
there might be
he has been.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
There might be fragments or artifacts of conversations that they had leading up to the Yarn v2 implementation. So we might be able to find those and sort of go back in history.
I tried looking for those. By all means, yeah, that would be great if you can find them. I tried and I could not find them in their repos. The hard part is it's a big old mono repo. So like there's conversations about all sorts of topics all mixed in. So it's really hard to even do keyword searches and find anything reasonable. So I spent maybe an hour looking for stuff and couldn't find anything.
Good note on mono repos.
Yeah, that's what you get. One other thing, I do know he has been active recently in that issue on what package manager is shipped with Node in the Node repo. So maybe we could reach out under the, in the future, we need to have a better communication channel for how these things affect the greater Node community, which I think the package maintenance working group is a great place to have those kind of conversations. But if that is the format of the conversation, it might help provide a good, like you said, neutral ground for a healthy conversation.
I want to actually touch on something real quick. Just I'm looking over the notes I took here about the complicated case, Wes. If we did if we implemented resolutions such that the key is a range and the value is a different range, I'm not sure if that would solve your use case. Like, let's say I have a version of a package X that exists in 4 instances in the logical graph, and I want to override it only in this one specific instance, right? So let's say version 2 of X at 2 is fine for most of my app, but it causes an error with this other package Y that I'm using. So essentially what I want to do is override Y's dependency on X, but not any other X at 2.
Yes, I just put in the chat so this is sort of what people did, except they didn't have the at 15 part. They just said path to dep goes to dep. It goes to
and you don't even have to do an arcane string DSL. You could just have nested objects in there, right? Like you could say like dep : and then another object, and then for that dep, the same structure.
Interesting. Yeah, that is kind of more elegant.
Could you write out what you mean there, just so I'm clear?
Let me do it.
Oh, if you're on a touch, it's fine. We can.
Yeah, I'm on an iPad, so that'd be great if someone could.
I will do it. At least what I think you're doing. So I have Y.
And I will copy and paste and put notes.
Oh, I'm not going to write. I'm going to write it in the notes because Zoom chat is
awesome.
vexing me here.
It's awesome.
Sure.
So I would say, Y at 1, and instead of doing a range, I set an object, and in here I do X at
React
2 goes
yeah.
to.
Exactly like that, and you could have them as deeply nested as you wanted, and the like CSS or something, the most granular one takes precedence. And
this seems like a much more elegant solution than what they did with the path glob patterns. I agree. I like this a lot.
And just a question on these examples: do you actually want to allow to provide a module name So like someone could replace like React at 15 by Preact or some something that accepts the same API.
A really common use case for that is I found a bug in a package we use, and I've made a PR, but the maintainer is not as responsive as I'd like. So one common option is that people fork it internally until like while that PR is happening, or they even fork it publicly under a scope. And being able to drop that in for the other is very important.
Well, that would still be the thing that goes after the @ sign.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't think that's quite what Roy's asking. I think because then what you could do is, like, let's say the result, the value, right, when the value is a string, is some package spec, right? So let's make it even more general than saying it has to be a range or a version. It's some package spec, and the package spec could be a get URL or an HTTP URL or whatever, or even a file or tarball, whatever you want to do.
Or like npm : something else.
I guess if we can make it a package spec, then we can make it a different name. Like you could do npm : Preact at some version.
Just to
I mean, like if I can already use.
Sorry, folks. We're just at time, so we can keep this going for another 5 minutes if folks can stay on. I know there's a conflicting modules working group call right now, so if you have to drop off, let me know. But let's give this maybe another 5 minutes, and then
we might be able to resolve some of this offline too, as long as we just are aware that aliasing to a different module name should be a requirement.
Well,
not just,
philosophically, NPM has already answered that question. That yes, that should be okay, because you can alias one package to another with the alias stuff, right?
Well, wait.
Right. That's already a capability.
Yeah.
So that's a philosophical question that NPM has already like since answered, and so it would be really weird if resolutions did not allow that when NPM has already said it's cool to do that. Swap out one package for a different one, I mean, not just a different version.
Yep. Okay, so was there anything else you wanted to add there, Isaac? I apologize, I cut you off in mid-sentence.
So I was going to say that it might be kind of nice just as a way to kind of guide users to say that the value should not include the package name. It should only be a spec. So I could say x at 1 will resolve to 1.2.3, y at 1 can resolve to npm : x at 1.2.3. And so if you want to do aliasing, it just has to be explicit that that's an alias, but the name of the thing that gets installed is still going to be the same as the left of the @ sign in the key.
So I see you've updated the examples there if folks are wondering. And I see Wes is using Zoom's reactions. So thumbs up.
Yeah, without the camera, I can't give my typical like on-screen thumbs up, so.
Yeah, like essentially if the right-hand side can either be a package spec or an object like that's a recursive type, then that seems fine to me.
Right, and so in these cases up above, it would not be React at 16 becomes React at 16.1.2. It would just be React at 16 becomes 16.1.2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Wait, is this example correct here? I think the example you wrote here with NPM, what you want is Y being aliased. So NPM, I'm confused here. Oh, X is the alias here, is what you're saying?
I'm saying
it is where Y at 1 would appear, X at 132 appears instead.
Yeah, okay.
That's right. So then the question is that subject to the previous resolutions, right? Should X at 132 be rewritten to X at 1.2.3? And I think the answer is no, because this is not a case where you're depending on X at 1. This is a case where you're depending on Y at 1 and you're aliasing it.
So import maps asked the same question, and they made the decision that you just said, no. Okay. I think that it's a defensible thing to do. It's worse with import maps because it means that you can't, like, you have to like repeat a bunch of things in your import map instead of kind of letting like having indirection where you say like, you know, X points to Y points to Z. Like you have to say X points to Z and Y points to Z. But like, I think that in this case, since resolutions is a app level feature, it's not going to have a graph of them. Your resolutions are likely to not be a very long list, hopefully. It doesn't seem that problematic. But you know, that is the trade-off being made, essentially, is foregoing the ability to have a nice programming-ish kind of like redirect chain.
So just to be mindful again here, we're about 5 minutes past the hour, and appreciate everybody jumping on and giving feedback here. I think we're going to continue this conversation and potentially actually come up. It seems like there might be some consensus around like how we could move forward with a nice spec-ish or at least hypothetical spec for or schema for resolutions, which might be a bit different than the way that Yarn has approached this. So yeah, so appreciate Wes, Jordan.
Well, so one thing we need to strongly consider, which hasn't been mentioned yet, is there needs to be a compatibility mode. So if we're using the same resolutions key that exists in the package JSON today, we need to make sure that that either continues to work or breaks in a very predictable way, so that we can move users forward. This calls strongly into question who owns package JSON, right? And the fact that we don't have an owner means that Yarn was able to go ahead and just say, we take the resolutions key and we've now defined some behavior around it. I think we should consider what that looks like moving forward, so we don't say, no, we own it.
Well, I think NPM and Node own package JSON. That said, we shouldn't capriciously break Yarn users.
NPM and Node hold package JSON in trust on behalf of the real owners, which are all of the users of JavaScript. That's
better way to
kind
look
of the mindset that I adopt with this. So if there's something that's currently in wide usage, like we try very, very hard not to break that. Now, if it's something that's not in very wide usage, but some other, if PNPM was using some field in package.json and 1% of PNPM users were using it, and that's, 1% of users of the NPM registry, I'd be like, maybe we just break it. Like, it's fine, nobody's using it. But, and so it's not the case of like whoever kind of just starts using it first has a permanent right to it, but it is the case where if it's in broad usage by the NPM user base, okay, then we have to take that very seriously.
I see this like the JavaScript language is that like it's like the standard isn't going to break people if it can avoid it, but the messaging should be that if you're not the standard, you shouldn't be like without coordination claiming global names.
Yeah, I think this is a good discussion to have in a separate issue if we want to talk about the position we're taking. Although, again, we're definitely mindful of trying to support the existing community tooling. Similar, we're doing a similar thing with workspaces to try to ensure that there's cross compatibility as much as possible.
Yeah, I guess my point there, and I don't want to extend the conversation too long, but my point there was the explicitly said trying to support Yarn style workspaces was the intent with workspaces. We have just said we are explicitly going to implement something different than what is in Yarn resolutions. And I just want to make sure that we're very clear. There is a difference there, and we need to make sure we reconcile those before shipping.
Yeah, that would be part of the RFC. We would put the intent there and make that explicit. So, yeah.
Simplest approach is we just pick a new key name, and I think that's probably fine.
That's also possible. Yeah.
So,
awesome. So appreciate again you folks jumping on. Thought this was actually super helpful. So hopefully we can actually put together an RFC eventually for this. And I know that this is something that's been coming up a lot with the fact that we're installing PeerDeps again by default. So resolutions is also like something that you know, we see as a potential mechanism for helping with some bugs we've been seeing with workspaces. So yeah, appreciate everybody jumping on, and hopefully talk with you next week.
Cheers.
All right.
Bye,
Cheers.
everybody.